Okay, guys, so in part one, we had just finished by talking about, the factors that influence the type of learners that you are. Okay, so coming then to the main three types of learners that the research has thrown up so far, we're talking about our visual learners, our auditory learners, and our kinesthetic learners. Okay, as you can see from this graphic here, the vast majority, or rather just nearly 2/3 of all learners fit into the visual learner category, while about 30%, the other dominant group, fit under the auditory. And as you can see here, kinesthetic is probably the most unusual learner type. Okay, so when we're talking about learning strategies, then, okay, I'm coming back to that again before we continue talking about the learner types, because the learning strategies will derive from the type of learner that you are. What are strategies? Well, they're ways of approaching learning of materials, how you use materials. If you have a lack of knowledge in a particular area, or you have failed communication of knowledge in an area, it's how you compensate for that. It's how you go about practicing your skills. And it's how you also go about mastering tasks within and outside the classroom. Okay. And again, just like second language acquisition, learner types and learning styles are completely learner centric. Okay. So they are looking at the behavioral patterns and the thought processes within the learners that support the learning process. And we know that they require activity, they require reflexivity, where you think back on what you're actually doing and the reasons why. And they require formative action by the learner. So these strategies are not things that happen necessarily automatically. They do require effort from the learners. And it's very important to say from the very beginning as well that strategies are neither positive nor negative, and they vary very widely from person to person. So because most learners have aspects of the different learning types depending on the task that they're dealing with, the strategies chosen by the learners will vary from time to time. But what we do know is that if a learner knows what type of learner they are and they effectively choose learning strategies depending on the type of learner they are, we know that learning is more successful, and it doesn't lead to a situation where it fails, where there's frustration, and where there's demotivation. So our visual learners, as it says on the tin, they need to see information. They really like body language and facial expressions. They are the things they kind of remember when they're dealing with in a classroom setting, when they're dealing with learning new information. They tend to think in pictures, and they learn best from diagrams, illustrative textbooks, videos, and handouts. And they really like taking detailed notes as a way of retaining information. Okay, so they're the people that tend to have very detailed notes. And they usually prefer sitting up at the front of the class to try and avoid any visual distractions that might be around them. So what are some of the strategies then for visual learners? Well, creating outlines, again, that kind of graphical and very visual representation of information. They really like using flashcards or the equivalent of flashcards, again, incorporating that strongly visual component. Highlighting, circling, and underlining information in texts is very good for visual learners. They really like diagrams, so organizing information visually, again, within a diagram situation. And they really enjoy images and video clips as ways of learning. Our auditory learners then, as you may have guessed, they really like to hear information. And they really learn best from verbal lectures, from discussions, from talking things through with their teachers and with their colleagues in class, and listening to what others have to say. And they need to hear the tone, the pitch, and the speed of a person's voice when they're learning information. So what are some of the strategies then for the auditory learners? Well, attend and listening in class is something that auditory learners really enjoy and really benefit from. They tend to repeat things out loud while studying, and I do that myself sometimes. If I'm giving a paper at a conference even, I often have the PowerPoint in front of me and I'm walking around my bedroom and my sitting room talking the slides out, because that really helps me retain the information. They like to use study groups in order to discuss materials verbally in order to be able to engage with them better. Things like podcasts are very useful for these types of learners, audiobooks, and even self-recorded orally delivered notes. So, you sitting down, recording yourself, reading out your notes that you've taken down and listening to that back is something very useful. So obviously this particular type of delivery of the lectures is going to be something that's going to be popular with our auditory learners. And then to the final category, we're looking at our kinesthetic learners, and these are the most unusual type of learners. And they need to move, do, or touch things to learn effectively. And they always learn best with a hands-on approach, be it in-class experiments, sitting at a computer and physically working with a new piece of software and figuring out all of its idiosyncrasies, going on field trips. Trial and error approaches to things are something kinesthetic learners tend to work very well with. Now, these are also the type of people that may struggle to sit still. So they tend the types of people who, when they're sitting in class, they have to frequently move certain body parts in order to expel the kinetic energy that builds up in their bodies. So what are the good things then, the sort of strategies that kinesthetic learners can use very well? Well, multiple short study sessions are really good. So sitting down for 5, 10, 15 minutes, working on something, then going and physically doing something else, then coming back, doing another short little study session, then going off and doing something physically again. So it's important for these people to have that kind of physical movement built into things. Group study sessions are also very good for these kinesthetic guys because they tend to be quite animated in groups and they like to be walking around the room while they're talking things out in group study sessions. Flashcards, because again, the physical movement of the cards is something that these guys respond well to. Memory games, likewise, again, the physical movement. And listening to recordings while they're doing other types of physical activities. So you have your podcast on, AirPods in, and you're out for a walk, or you're out hiking, or you're running on a treadmill, or whatever you're doing, where you're physically moving, but you're listening to the information in the background. Okay? So you need to think about all of those kind of things when you figure out the type of learner you are. You need to also think about what sort of strategies work very well for you. And the more you know about that and the more you implement those strategies, the more effective your learning is going to be. Okay, so just to kind of finish off this lecture, and I promised this from the very beginning, from all of the research that's out there, and IFE's research is pretty good in this area, what are the aspects of language proficiency that change the most on the year abroad context and why? Well, the first thing we know is that formal grammar does improve, but it only improves to a very limited capacity. And why is this? Well, again, because when you're in an immersion setting and you're interacting with native speakers, communication and efficiency tends to become the most important concern. So you become less obsessed with grammatical accuracy and rather more focused on the message that you're trying to get across. So we know that when it's just an immersion situation, that formal grammar doesn't necessarily improve massively. That said, depending on the type of learner you are, you might find that your grammar comes along massively because you tend to reflect on the grammar that you're using within interactions. Likewise, if you're doing some formal classroom learning while on your year abroad, that can reinforce the formal grammar learning. Reading literacy, again, improves, but only improves to a very kind of limited extent. The reason that this is the case is while you might be reading lots and lots of texts while you're on the year abroad, you may not necessarily be analysing them in the same way that you would go about analysing them in a formal classroom setting. And again here, if you have the opportunity to engage with reading literacy during your year abroad, then do it. It'll stand to you in terms of the proficiency that you are able to develop. Writing abilities, again, we know that they improve, but they only improve marginally. And this is for many, many reasons. Again, if you think about it, if you are making lots of friends in the German-speaking context who are native speakers, you might be doing lots and lots of texting. And of course, just as the case is in English, text speech is very different from formal correct speech. So you might find that your use of colloquial language in writing comes on massively, but maybe your use of more formalized writing not so much. Unless, again, of course, you are taking classes where you're required to write essays and formal academic writing, and then you might find that there's some improvement there. One area that absolutely explodes is listening and comprehension abilities, and they increase significantly on the year abroad. In fact, almost anybody who comes back from being on the year abroad will tell you that they have absolutely no problems anymore understanding German. And that's a big benefit for going on the year abroad, and you see that, and that's something that develops in the vast majority of cases. We also see quite a significant increase in native-like phonetics. So, the little phonetic things that you guys maybe necessarily don't do a lot of work on at the moment and maybe don't put an awful lot of effort into in oral exams, they tend to become more naturalized on the year abroad context. So people that, who may have come out saying ick, suddenly come back with a lovely ich, or, there's lots of different phonetic gains that you guys make on the year abroad context. Anxiety to use the language decreases significantly, and that's really important, yeah? So the more you're listening and actively using the language on the year abroad context, the more your anxiety levels associated with using German will drop. And that's really important for when you come back and you're in final year and you're using the language within the classroom setting and you're sitting in an oral exam and suddenly you realize, I'm no longer as anxious to use German as I once was. What we also see is that the ability for lateral thinking increases, and instances of hesitation and paralysis decrease massively when you come back from the year abroad. So your ability to work laterally in the language, so that if you encounter a hole in your language ability, that you have the competence to work around that and to think laterally about another way of saying something. And also the hesitation that's there a lot of the time when you're using the language before the year abroad, that falls away quite significantly when you come back. One area that also increases quite significantly, but again, this is very much dependent on the effort you put in as a learner, is both the scope and depth of your foreign language lexicon. So as all of you, I'm sure, will admit, your level of vocabulary knowledge in German is potentially not as high as it should be. But by being in the year abroad context and by learning new vocabulary and using and actively implementing new vocabulary on a daily basis, you find that the scope and the depth of your foreign language vocabulary increases, and that's really positive. One area that's also quite a strong development is where we see sociolinguistic and pragmatic competence increasing. So you get to understand more about how Germans think and how they see the world and how they behave and what are the norms for behavior within German culture. You also start to see things like how politeness varies quite significantly between cultures and how humor and perception of humor can vary massively between cultures. And you learn to work between the norms of the different cultures in these areas in a very nuanced way. And phraseology competence also improves massively. So your ability to express yourself beyond the most basic correct sentences, to use more idioms, to use more vernacular terms, that tends to increase hugely too. Okay, and so the final side here really is normally an interactive one that I do in class with you guys, but unfortunately we can't do that given the current circumstances. But really, what I want you to think about just for a moment is what sort of language learning activities will present themselves within the year abroad context and what will be their impact on you as a learner, okay? And so the areas here that we're going to be talking about would be listening to the radio, watching television, going to the cinema, reading newspapers and magazines, socializing with native speakers, engaging with language classes, participating in non-language classes, and harnessing these classes as a language learning experience, and self-reflexivity. So how do you guys think that all of these will impact on your language learning within the year abroad context? That's something for you guys to think about. And that's what I'll draw this lecture to a close with. So thanks everyone for listening. Make sure to follow the instructions and keep up to date on everything on Moodle. And also make sure to keep up to date on everything that Lisa is posting here online on the tutorial side of things. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you all again next week. Bye guys.